Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 289, Promise Unfulfilled. Dudley struck gold. Early on in 551, he was able to reach an agreement with Henry II, the King of France. There would be a new French-English alliance, and to seal the deal, King Edward VI would marry Henry's daughter, Elizabeth. With this alliance firmly in place, Dudley now felt confident enough to resolve the problem of Mary and her disobedience. The revival of the Habsburg-Valois conflict, the intermittent rivalry, as we know, between the ruling houses of France and the Empire, which had torn most of Italy, northern Italy that is, asunder, also meant that Emperor Charles V had his hands tied and would be unlikely to come to the rescue of his cousin Mary. The only sticking point was any potential resistance at home. Mary had her supporters, notably, of course, Somerset, and then the Catholic Earls of Arundel, Derby, and Shrewsbury, who voiced their opposition to her treatment back in the spring. Dudley decided to keep his enemies close, and on August the 9th, Arundel and Derby were drafted onto the council for one day only for an extraordinary meeting at Richmond, where it was resolved to prohibit the saying of any mass or divine service within Mary's household. Dudley's plan was to prove that he meant business. By ensuring that Arundel and Derby signed up for his latest round of attacks on Mary, he forced them to show their hand, leaving them with only choice to rebel or to remain in silence. On the 23rd of August, 3 officers of Mary's household, Rochester, Englefield, and Waldegrave, were charged with disobedience and sent to the Tower of London. With the unified agreement, the council now turned to Mary. When a deputation led by Lord Rich visited her at the end of August, ordering her chaplains desist from saying Mass in the future, they were welcomed by a defiant and somewhat histrionic performance from Mary, who told them that rather than, quote, use any other service, I will lay my head on a block and suffer death, end quote. This is, as we know, her sort of common refrain. She blamed the council for her current sickness. She was actually ill, and again refused to acknowledge that Edward had any part in her treatment, naively insisting that he was simply too young to understand what was going on. But with the emperor's support having evaporated, Mary was in no position to call the shots. She caved in, and her protest died down. For the next 2 years, her household heard no Mass, as Mary alone continued to console herself with her own private devotions behind closed doors. There is a chance, of course, that Dudley's attack on Mary was caused purely by the situation abroad. But the actual reasons are likely far deeper. The reality was, Mary was merely the means by which Dudley wanted to finally and conclusively bring down Somerset. Somerset's position was increasingly becoming untenable. He had taken the opportunity to side with the Princess Mary, over religious freedoms that he himself had granted her during his time as protector. It was probably no coincidence that Somerset's planned attack on Dudley had taken place after Edward's showdown with Mary. Then the Duke had managed to galvanize the members of the conservative nobility, outraged by the princess's treatment, into supporting his potential schemes. With Derby's support secured at a meeting on August the 9th, this time he hoped it would be different. As the attacks on Mary grew increasingly degrading, Dudley refused, for example, to recognize her royal title as princess, calling her only the king's sister. Somerset made the suggestion that her household be able to hear Mass, provoking a furious outburst from Dudley. He retorted, quote, The Mass is either of God or the devil. If it is of God, it is but right that all our people should be allowed to go to it. But if it is not out of God, as we are taught in the Scriptures, then why should we not allow the voice of this fury, i.e. the Mass, prescribed to all? According to Edward, the meeting on August the 9th that resolved to take action against Mary had only been agreed to at length. Maybe Somerset had even been reluctant to sign the agreement. Dudley had now pushed Somerset too far. During the end of August, and after Mary's confrontation with the various lords, Somerset met with the Earl of Arundel to discuss how to finally bring down Dudley. As their plans continued to be set throughout the autumn, Dudley realized that he would need to act fast, particularly given the fact that the emperor's sister, Mary of Hungary, was making disconcerting noises about organizing an invasion to free Edward from the hands of his current counselors. Dudley needed to send out a message, both to the remaining conservatives at home and to Mary's allies abroad, that he meant business. Within 2 weeks, Lord Somerset once more found himself in the Tower of London. The final pieces fell into place in October of 1551, when Dudley was visited by Sir Thomas Palmer, a former associate of Somerset's, but who had now drawn in close with Dudley. The evidence for their meeting comes entirely from Edward's diary, but it seems that Palmer divulged to Dudley how Somerset had planned to, quote, raise the people, end quote. A banquet had been planned, at which Dudley and Northampton were to be assassinated, the method of execution being to simply cut off their heads. A red wedding of sorts, I suppose. 4 days later, Palmer had further confessed that Somerset's follower, Sir Ralph Vane, had 2,000 men prepared to act. Another supporter, Miles Patridge, was to raise London with the hope of certain apprentices seizing the Great Seal and then the Tower of London. Alexander Seymour, a distant relative of Somerset's, and Lawrence Hammond, possibly a yeoman of the guard, we're not sure, were to ensure that all the horses were to be slain to prevent an escape. Whether Palmer's accusations were true or false remains to be seen. But for the moment, it gave Dudley all the evidence that he needed to destroy his greatest enemy once and for all. But first, Dudley needed to bolster his support. He did this with the creation of new peerages, essentially new titles of nobility, the same tactic he had used before in the winter of 1549, when he planned to destroy Wriothesley. In an age of ruthless ambition, it turned out loyalty could be easily bought. Henry Grey suddenly became Duke of Suffolk. William Paulet was promoted to the Marquess of Winchester. William Herbert, having been created Lord Herbert the previous day, now found himself in just 48 hours going from nobody to an earldom, the Earl of Pembroke, no less. Dudley awarded himself a dukedom, I guess for fun, becoming the Duke of Northumberland. In one sense, the giving of titles, in fact, merely reflected the existing political situation of Dudley's, now Northumberland's, dominance. He was now undoubtedly the most important nobleman of the land, holding 3 of the 5 most important offices of state. By mid-October, it was clear that Somerset's days were numbered. On October the 15th, the power Lord Northumberland, and I'm going to refer to Dudley as Northumberland from now on, moved against Somerset's remaining allies. King Edward recorded the following events in his diary, quote, "This morning, none was at Westminster of the conspirators. The first was the Duke, who came later than he was wont of himself. After dinner, he, Somerset, was apprehended. Sir Thomas Palmer was taken on the terrace, walking there. Hammond, passing by the vice-chamberlain's door, was called in by John Pearce to make a match at shooting, and so he was taken. Newgate was called for from my lord his master, and he was taken. Likewise were John Seymour and Dave Seymour. Sir Thomas Arundel was also taken, and Lord Grey coming out of the country. Vane, upon sendings of my lord, was not so stout, and if he could not get a comb, he cared for none of them all. He was discovered hiding beneath the straw of his stable at Lambeth. These all went with the Duke, Somerset, to the Tower, saving Palmer, Arundel, and Vane, who were kept in chambers here, apart." End quote. And so just like that, all of Somerset's allies found themselves locked in the Tower of London. This matters because just a few days prior, on October the 12th, 1551, Edward turned 14. This was the age when many kings achieved the age of majority and took the reins of power for themselves. Edward was already deeply engaged in the administration of the realm. While his father may have been bored with the minutiae of state, Edward was not, throwing himself into whatever tasks he might have been assigned. Had he lived, spoiler alert, he's not going to, which you could probably tell by the title of this episode, he might have made an excellent king. On October the 22nd, members of the Privy Council announced they had gotten to the bottom of Somerset's various plots. Evidently, the wicked Duke had intended to capture the Tower of London, burn down the capital, and then sail away. That made no sense at all. Hardly anybody believed the accusations. You may as well have accused him of intending to kidnap the Pope and burn Rome to the ground. Still, what few allies Somerset had remaining began to melt away, whether out of fear or simply a conviction that they were backing the wrong horse. It was only a matter of time now before Somerset himself would be accused of treason. Indeed, the clock was ticking rather quickly, for on November the 16th, charges of treason were already drawn up. On the night of November 30th, 1551, Somerset was informed that his trial would begin the following morning. Stripped of his Order of the Garter, he remained defiant, declaring he wouldn't confess a thing. The next day, security remained tight. Armed officers with their swords visible, but not drawn, were placed in strategic positions, while that night a double watch was kept, with every householder ordered to, quote, see to his family and keep his house, end quote. To prevent a large crowd gathering, Somerset was brought from the Tower to Westminster by a boat at 5 a.m. Despite this, 2 men drowned in the Thames as they sought to catch a glimpse of the Duke as he passed under London Bridge. The trial lasted from 8 a.m. until 3 p.m. The charges were laid out, quote, Edward, Duke of Somerset, did on the 20th of April, at his mansion house called Somerset Place, in the Strand, compass and imagine, with other persons, to deprive the king of his royal dignity, and to seize the king's person, and at his, the Duke's will and pleasure, exercise royal authority. That the Duke, in order to carry out his traitorous intentions into effect, together with Michael Stanhope, Miles Patridge, Thomas Holcroft, Francis Newgate, and other persons, assembled for the purpose of taking and imprisoning John, now Duke of Northumberland. Furthermore, that the said Duke of Somerset compassed to obtain possession of the Great Seal, and also to obtain possession of the Tower of London, and of the treasure, jewels, and munitions of war therein contained. And furthermore, that the said Duke of his own authority incited the citizens and inhabitants of London to rebellion and insurrection against the king, with drums and trumpets, crying out English liberty, liberty, and for the purpose of robbing and destroying such other citizens and inhabitants as would not follow his will. Somerset, though, remained defiant. He still had some support, and he knew it. Moreover, he knew that the charges, or at least the bulk of the charges, were false. Crowds gathered outside Westminster chanting, God save the Duke, so his belief that he had significant support remaining in London was true. Moments later, the crowd erupted into applause when, lo and behold, Somerset had been found innocent of the treason charges. Yet the adulation was premature. The sentencing was not quite finished. Somerset, found innocent of treason, had nonetheless been found guilty of committing a felony, in this case orchestrating an unlawful assembly. For that crime, he was sentenced to death by hanging. The Duke fell to his knees in shock. In the end, there was little other he could do than to beg Northumberland to look after his wife and children. Northumberland agreed, and later would write privately that he regretted his role in the whole affair. Now, of course, all of this ignores that there definitely was a real conspiracy in April of 1551. Somerset himself had admitted a plot to marry Edward to his daughter and thus reinstall himself as Lord Protector. Whether there was enough evidence to convict him or not, the English lords determined Somerset was simply too dangerous to be left alive. What Northumberland did not expect was the negative reaction to the news of Somerset's sentence. It didn't help that there were plenty of rumors flying around the country that now Northumberland wanted 100% control of the government for himself, compounded by news that King Edward physically was not well. At 8 o'clock in the morning on the 22nd of January 1552, Somerset was brought out of the Tower. Surrounded by an entourage of armed guard, he was led to Tower Hill. Despite Northumberland's attempts to prevent an audience from being present by moving the time of the execution 3 hours ahead, a huge crowd had already gathered. Some still held out hope that the king's pardon might grant the Duke a last reprieve, others to pay their respects to a man that they considered to be their hero. When he had reached the scaffold, Somerset knelt down on both knees. Raising his hands, he commended himself to God. A nobleman nearby recognized the gesture as one that he had frequently used in his household. After reciting a few short prayers, he stood to face the east of the scaffold. Emotionless at the sight of the axe's blade, he displayed a cheerfulness of mind, according to one source, as he bowed and addressed the crowd as follows: "Masters and good fellows, I am come hither to die, but a true and faithful man as any was unto the king's majesty and to his realm. But I am condemned by a law whereunto I am subject, and are we all, and therefore to show obedience I am content to die. Wherewith I am well content, being a thing most heartily welcome unto me, for which I do thank God, taking it for a singular benefit, as ever might have come to me. For, as I am a man, I have deserved at God's hands many deaths, and it has pleased his goodliness, whereas he might have taken me suddenly, that I should neither have known him nor myself, thus now to visit me, and call me with this present death, as you do see, where I have had time to remember and acknowledge him, and to know also myself, for which I do thank him most heartily. And my friends, more I have to say to you concerning religion. I have always, being in authority, a further of it, to further the glory of God to the utmost of my power, whereof I am nothing sorry, but rather have cause and do rejoice most gladly, that I have so done for the mightiest benefit of God that ever I had, or any man might have in this world, beseeching you all to take it so, and follow it on still, for if it not will follow a worse, and will come a great plague." End quote. Suddenly, again, according to the sources, at that last phrase, a great plague, a thunderous sound burst across the skies. The crowd began to scatter in confusion. Some ran into nearby houses. Others dived into the tower ditch. Many just fell to the ground and groveled. Sir Anthony Bown, who was there, circled beneath the scaffold on his horse, attempting to calm the crowd. The message quickly spread. The king had sent his uncle a pardon. Caps and cloaks were suddenly thrown into the air, and chants of "God save the king" went up. But of course there was no pardon. Shouts of rejoicing soon turned to sorrow and tears. All the while, Somerset had remained quiet, standing on the same spot of the scaffold, his hat still in his hand. Finally, he made a sound to quiet the crowd. Then he continued, "There is no such thing, good people. There is no such thing." He's talking about the pardon. "It is the ordinance of God thus for to die, wherewith we must be content. And I pray you be quiet, for I myself am quiet, and make you no stirring. And I pray you, now let us pray together for the King's majesty, to whose grace I have always been faithful, a true and loving subject, desirous always of his most prosperous success in all affairs, and ever glad of the furtherance and helping forth ward of the commonwealth of this realm." His speech was repeatedly interrupted by cries of "Yea, yea," and "Amen." It was a time for old wounds to be healed as well. Somerset looked to God for forgiveness. He claimed he had made mistakes and asked God to forgive them. He urged for silence repeatedly and constantly asked for the crowd to forgive him, but to believe in Edward, to believe in the future. There was one observer who wrote an observation. His name was Antonio de Guras. He was a Catholic, and he was hostile to everything that he was seeing before him. But still, everything that was happened was scarcely believable. He thought for certain there would be a struggle, at least one last attempt to gain freedom. Surely, this man would later write, quote, "If he had cast himself from the scaffold or struggling with the executioner, assuredly he had not died there. He was not held of any chains or bonds, it being the custom to exempt noblemen from these when they were led to the scaffold. The guard, among others, would have connived at his escape on account of the favor of the people. Somerset, in the end, this man declared, was killed by, quote, a want of spirit," end quote. The Duke turned to kneel. He was presented with a scroll containing his confession. Without hesitation, he read it aloud, returned to his feet. He then shook hands with everyone on the scaffold and rewarded the executioner with a few coins, set aside in the hope that he would deliver a blow that was quick and painless. Taking off Somerset's gown, the executioner turned the stiff collar around in order not to hinder the stroke of the axe. Somerset's cheeks turned visibly red. As the axe fell, the crowd groaned. The body was thrown onto a cart and was taken away in the Tower. Throughout the day, crowds came to the execution site to talk about the Duke, lamenting and bewailing his death. Edward was overcome at the news of his uncle's death. It was said that if Somerset's name ever came up, Edward would sigh and fall to tears, saying, quote, his uncle had done nothing, or if he had, it was very small, and it proceeded from his wife than from himself. And where then said he was the good nature of a nephew? Where was this clemency of a prince? Ah, how unfortunate have I, Edward, been to those of my blood. My mother I slew at my birth, and since have made away 2 of her brothers, and happily to make a way for others against myself. Was it ever known before that a king's uncle, a lord protector, one whose fortunes had advanced the honor of the realm, did lose his head for a felony? For a felony, neither clear in law, and in fact, weakly proved. Now, there was another issue with Somerset's death, and that was church reform. Northumberland wasn't necessarily a reformer. He wasn't opposed to it, but it certainly wasn't the first thing on his mind. If he came to power, Cranmer's cause might well collapse, or at the very least, the reform would probably proceed at a much slower pace. The Reform Party's only real hope now was that Edward would come of age, that Edward would take power and complete the Reformation of the English Church. But the clock was ticking. Somerset was dead. Northumberland was completely ascendant. Edward, for his part, loved Northumberland reportedly like a father. But Edward was also ready to rule. There could be no denying that he had begun to take upon himself a greater share of the government of England. His diary entries, especially in early 1552, reflect a growing consciousness of his own authority. Despite every sign that Edward was maturing into a king able to seize the reins of power, there is no surviving evidence for his involvement in the formulation of the Second Book of Common Prayer, authorized in April 1552 and brought into use of November the 1st of that year. This book was to act as a clarification to the 1549 prayer book, which, despite acting as a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism, was most probably intended only as a temporary measure and had pleased no one, especially the reformers, who shirked at any mention of the Mass in the text. The reformer John Hooper would later write, quote, "I am so much offended with that book that if it not be corrected, I neither can nor will communicate with the Church in the administration of the supper," end quote. At the same time, as the reformers embedded themselves as bishops in their new sees, they had been horrified to discover the state of religion. Attendance at the church was poor. Half the priests Hooper met could not recite the 10 Commandments, and most were continuing to use forbidden ceremonies. Many simply found ways to work around the 1549 prayer book while retaining the essential elements of their Catholic belief. The noblewoman, Lady Marney, whose will requested that she be buried with full Catholic pomp, including masses sung for her soul, could see no contradiction that on the day of the burial she wanted sung, quote, "Such service is set out or appointed by the king's book," i.e. the prayer book. Meanwhile, despite the smashing of images, the whitewashing of churches, and the toppling of altars, destruction could never amount to conversion and the formation of a Protestant nation. Reforms had not been followed through with preaching and discipline. The reformer Martin Bucer told Edward in person in 1550, only, quote, "by means of ordinances which the majority obey very grudgingly, and by the removal of the instruments of ancient superstition," end quote. Something simply had to be done, and a uniform order imposed upon every church. In doing so, the new revised Book of Common Prayer made a decisive break with the past. Ceremonies that had been retained in the old service and had been condemned by Protestants were now removed, and the baptism, confirmation, and burial services rewritten with an end to any possibility of prayers for the dead. The way communities viewed their world order was transformed drastically. In the communion service, many prayers were omitted and the former structure of the Mass removed. Any hint of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine actually transformed into the body and blood of Christ, were removed, with emphasis being placed instead on the remembrance of Christ's sacrifice. Quote, "Take this and eat it," underlined, in remembrance, underlined, and that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith and with thanksgiving. All mention of the Virgin Mary, saints, and prophets now disappeared, as did all vestments, except for the priest's surplice, and music was reduced to a bare minimum, while in a final coda, a black rubric, tagged on after the book had gone to press, was forced to deny that kneeling at the communion suggested adoration in any way. In 1552, the prayer book was the high watermark for Edward's Reformation, and really, it was, in the words of another historian, the greatest single achievement of Edward's reign, albeit a short one. Its legacy lives on even today. It was the model of the Elizabethan book, which only slightly changed in 1662, and which is still the liturgy for the Church of England, as I speak right now in 2023. On April the 2nd, Edward fell ill with measles, and according to the records, smallpox, but he made a swift recovery. By late May, we have evidence that Edward was directly participating in government, signing warrants in his own hand for the first time. He was on the threshold of his power, and he knew it. In July, he took his first progress through the realm. By the time Edward returned, Northumberland was deeply depressed. England was once more in the throes of domestic unrest, and as a result of the enclosure crisis, and he knew that there was serious business to attend to. Worse still, England's debts continued to mount, and Northumberland feared its credit on the foreign market was on the verge of collapse. It was clear that the king needed to call Parliament to pass a subsidy and remain the debts, and he had to do it now. And Edward continued to come to his own. It was during late October that Edward met with Hieronymus Cardano, an Italian physician and astrologer, whose later account of their meeting is the most contemporary and possibly most objective account of Edward's abilities. Edward had apparently grown physically weak, and the council wished for Cardano to discover the nature of his illness and to cast his horoscope, which, again, was perfectly consistent with medicine at the time. Received by the king, Cardano found Edward to be of about middle height, pale-faced with large gray eyes, a grave aspect, but somewhat handsome, adding that he has rather a bad habit of body rather than a sufferer from fixed diseases. It appeared that he had a projecting shoulder blade, which gave him kind of a hunched look, which is what we see in a lot of the paintings of Edward. But he said that this defect did not amount to a deformity. The two conversed in Latin for a long time. Edward asked Cardano about his recent book, which actually had been dedicated to him. There then ensued a debate upon the nature of comments, during which Cardano considered Edward spoke Latin as politely and fluently as he did, but was reserved in his judgment of Edward's own reasoning, commenting that, of course, Edward just loved the liberal arts and sciences, but he didn't really know them yet. I mean, we have to remember this is still a 16-year-old kid here. He also noted that Edward seemed old before his time, carrying himself like an old man. Nevertheless, the Italian was impressed. He would later write, quote, "It might seem a miracle of nature to behold the excellent wilt and forwardness that appeared in him, being yet but a child. This I speak not rhetorically, to amplify things or to make them more true is, yea, the truth is more than I do utter," end quote. Edward's own interest in astronomy is readily evident in one of his orations, a lengthy defense of the practice written in 1551 against those who, quote, "hold that it is not useful to the body, nor the mind, nor the state, a view which ought not undeservedly to become affected by much cursing," end quote. He argued that astronomy is absolutely necessary to understanding the world. Edward, we know, owned various astronomical instruments, including a pillar of astronomy of white bone delivered to him, and also a dial of ivory. In November 1549, he ordered 2 cases of instruments of astronomy to be presented to him, and we have every reason to believe that they were. Cardano also found that Edward had a couple of other physical defects that he wrote down. He was short-sighted and a little deaf. This may have been caused by the difficulty of straining to understand the Italian's pronunciation of Latin, but certainly multiple people have confirmed that Edward had problems with sight, and he did own a pair of spectacles which he used as much as he could. Cardano and Edward actually met multiple times, and Cardano became impressed more and more each meeting. It is, again, kind of a wonder to think about what Edward might have become if he would have lived. Cardano then sat down to do the second thing he had come to do. He cast Edward's horoscope. This is a process that occupied him for around 100 hours. But again, remember, this is serious business back in the day. He calculated his life expectancy, and he predicted a long life for the king, though he did warn that the king would suffer major illnesses at the ages of 32, 34, and 55. Time, of course, would prove Cardano wrong on this final horoscope. Edward, in fact, would be dead within about a year. Still, there was a sense that the worst might be behind England as the calendar turned to 1552. Edward had restored relations with Princess Mary. Most of the king's foreign loans, around £130,000, about 24 million in today's money, had been repaid. But all the money in the world could not paper over one devastating reality. Edward was dying. In January, Edward fell ill with a fever and a cough. By the middle of that month, when Mary went to visit him, she found him bedridden. When Parliament opened that month, it was a somber affair. We do have a painting from this period that shows Edward administering over Parliament, which he almost certainly was not. Regardless, this would prove to be the last living painting of Edward that would ever be made. Edward had reached the threshold of power, on the very urge of taking the throne, but now he was too weak to cross it. In April, he was moved to Greenwich, where everyone prayed the clean air would speed his recovery. But a few days later, his condition once again deteriorated. The Privy Council continued to conduct business as usual, but there was little even they could do to hide the reality that Edward's life was nearing its end. It was now finally at this stage that Edward turned his attentions seriously to a document that he had been thinking about for a long time. He called it, quote, his devise, end quote, for the succession of the crown. This was the plan for, in the event of his death, an event that seemed to be quickly approaching, who would inherit the reins of state. Obviously, Edward didn't have any children of his own, and so in doing this, the goal was pretty simple. He was going to circumvent Henry VIII's succession plan, and he was going to disinherit his two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. This was remarkable and absolutely revolutionary. Edward was abandoning his family, turning against the traditional laws of inheritance and his late father's wishes. Instead, he was going to, by legal fiat, create a new dynasty, one founded in his opinion upon the true Reformed faith. Whatever the future held, Edward was determined that his dream of establishing an evangelical realm was going to survive beyond him. Edward probably made a start on the original draft early that year. His writing is bold and clear, hardly the work of someone suffering from a debilitating illness. Edward made it perfectly clear that he might still marry and have heirs of his own. Possibly he had been thinking of taking the problem of succession to Parliament, for the initial purpose of the document seems to have been to secure against a female succession, no doubt an anathema to the young king and the male-dominated Tudor society that he ruled. In any case, it seems that, at least at this stage, Northumberland was not aware of the king's intentions. For written and corrected in his own hand, this devise reads very much as Edward's own making. An anonymous French source believed that the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, John Gates, to be one of the, quote, principals who induced the king to make out his will to the prejudice of Lady Mary, end quote. But there could have been others. Different sources mention other high-ranking male officials like John Cheek, Thomas Goodrich, and the Bishop of Ely. All of these could have encouraged the king to work on his will at this point. Now, this should never be taken as evidence that Edward was browbeaten into writing out his own sisters from the succession. Rather, that the king took the widest possible counsel in drawing up plans for his new evangelical dynasty. According to the original draft, if Edward died childless, the crown would now descend through the male heirs of Frances, Duchess of Suffolk, the daughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary. The line of succession would then continue through the male heirs of Frances's daughters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, on the other hand, were to be effectively bought out of the succession. If they follow the advice of the executors and, quote, be bound to live in quiet order, end quote, they would both receive an annuity of £1,000. If they married according to the council's wishes, they would further receive a gift of £10,000, in addition to the top of the sum set out in Edward's bequest. Now, of course, the only problem to this plan was that there were no male heirs in Francis's line. It had been some time since Francis last gave birth to a child, and so, for the moment, Edward's male heir remained unborn, even if he was choosing this line. Thus, it was more crucial that the two unmarried daughters of Francis, Jane and Catherine, be married off as soon as possible. This is the aforementioned Jane Grey, who I talked about in a previous episode, person who's going to become, in a moment here, the shortest living monarch in English history. And so Jane and Catherine were duly married off right away. But even after both women were married, just a few days later, Edward and everyone around him realized he couldn't wait for a male heir, even if both of those women became pregnant instantaneously. He needed to choose somebody right now. Thus, he changed his final will to read that the crown should pass directly to Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs. That change was crucial. The crown would now go to Jane. Very few people knew of Edward's decision. Jane actually didn't know herself. For centuries, people assumed that Northumberland had been behind it all. But more recent scholarship has revealed that Edward thought deeply about the issue and made the decision himself. We know that Edward did not want the crown to pass to Catholic Mary, and that was probably his driving impulse. What led him to write out Elizabeth is a little bit trickier of a question. Regardless, by June the 11th, the imperial ambassador was frantically writing back to the continent that King Edward was near death. Edward had resolved in his own mind that Jane was to succeed him, but in order that the legal ends be properly tied up, on June the 12th, the judges of the King's Bench were summoned by the council to discuss the matter of the succession. Shown Edward's devise and commanded to turn it into a legal will, they were evidently dumbfounded and demanded more time. Conferring together, however, they considered the danger of treason in overturning the legal succession too great, and 2 days later, they simply refused. Northumberland flew into a rage. He denounced the Lord Chief Justice as a traitor and challenged them to the contrary, shouting that he would fight them then and there if he had to. Always a great legal strategy. Pick a fight with the judges. The judges then attempted a compromise. Okay, maybe Mary should be allowed to succeed to the throne if she swears to make no alteration to religion. Edward and all those around him sharply rejected that idea. The next day, the judges returned to face Edward himself. He demanded angrily to know why his wishes had not been obeyed, to which they explained that they didn't want to commit treason. Despite his growing weakness, Edward then proceeded to shout at them. He was convinced Mary would absolutely change the religion of the country, and in fact, he believed she would leave no stone unturned in her effort to gain control of the throne. And it would destroy the foundation of the new evangelical realm. He therefore resolved to, quote, disown and disinherit her together with her sister Elizabeth, as though she were a bastard and sprung from an illegitimate bed, end quote. In fact, the king would later write as follows, for indeed my sister Mary was the daughter by the king of Catherine of the Spaniard, who before she was married to my worthy father had been espoused to Arthur, my father's elder brother, and was therefore for this reason alone divorced by my father. But it was the fate of Elizabeth, my other sister, to have Anne Boleyn for a mother. This woman was indeed not only cast off by my father, because she was more inclined to couple with a number of courtiers, rather than reverencing her husband, so mighty a king, but also paid the penalty with her head, a greater proof of her guilt. Thus, in our judgment, they will be undeservedly considered as being numbered among the heirs of our king, beloved father, end quote. He demanded that his cousin Jane be his heir, and that the judges, upon their allegiance, draw up letters patent of his will. Northumberland realized the coming transition would be rocky, so he looked to France for military support to shore up his position. Henry II, still alive, needed allies to fight the emperor, so the union made sense on both sides. What neither side realized at the time was just how badly the English people were about to reject the idea of Queen Jane. Edward was now unable to keep food down and could not walk because his legs were so badly swollen. Realizing he had the upper hand, Henry II pressed Northumberland for a commitment of military force against the empire in exchange for a promise to support Jane. Northumberland, for his part, knew England was not in a position to make such a guarantee of strength, but he didn't have a choice. News of Edward's condition swept across Europe. In Brussels, the rumor was he was already dead. Charles V was not about to sit idly by and watch his niece, Mary, fail to secure the throne. If Northumberland had everything riding on Jane's ascension, Charles had the same riding on Mary's. So in late June, he sent a diplomatic team with instructions to see that the Catholic princess was the next Queen of England. Hence, as Edward lay dying, the battle lines were already drawn. On the evening of the 6th of July, 1553, Edward seemed at death's door. According to one witness, he raised his eyes to the heavens and said, "Lord, deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life, and take me among thy chosen. Howbeit not my will, but thy will be done. Lord, I commit my spirit to thee. O Lord, thou knowest how happy it were for me to be with thee. Yet for thy chosen sake, send me life and health that I may truly serve thee. O Lord, bless my people and save my inheritance. O Lord, save thy chosen people of England. O my God, defend my realm from papistry and maintain thy true religion, that I and my people may praise thy holy name, for the Son Jesus Christ's sake." It was moments later that he was asked what he was doing. Edward's response was, "I was praying to God." He then turned and uttered what were his last words. "I am faint. Lord, have mercy on me, and take my spirit." Then Edward VI, Henry VIII's only male heir, breathed his last. He was not quite 16 years old. Immediately there were rumors that Edward had been poisoned, and those rumors continued all the way into Elizabeth's reign. The exact cause of Edward's death has remained a matter of debate. The surgeon who later opened up Edward's chest found that, quote, "the disease whereon his majesty died was a disease of the lungs," end quote. Others recorded that he had a tough, straining cough that became more and more violent as he slowly weakened. Some people believed that Edward developed a cold after drinking from an infected cup after a game of tennis. We don't really know the truth. To understand the nature of Edward's illness, we can look back to April of 1552. Then Edward described in his journal how he fell sick with what he described as measles and smallpox. He made a quick recovery, but his brief illness was significant and most likely responsible for his eventual death. Modern research has shown that measles can suppress natural immunity to tuberculosis, reactivating the bacteria that can survive within ourselves, even within healthy lung tissue. The large cavities described by the surgeons opening up Edward's lungs after his death are typical of such a reactivation and actually can be seen in patients today. Edward was probably in close contact with at least one person who had tuberculosis, most likely after his contraction of measles. Modern studies have shown that exposure to tuberculosis would only need to be brief, perhaps even fleeting. If this was the case, it was only a matter of time after Edward had contracted measles that he would succumb to the disease. His swelling legs, failing pulse, and the loosening of his finger and toenails and changed skin color, signs that contemporaries took to be the work of poison, were actually secondary symptoms of the disease. Edward's death was lamented across the nation and beyond, where many considered it to have been a measure of divine punishment. The only question, though, was, if that was true, who was to be punished? For the whole of the next day, Edward's death was kept secret, but it did not take long for news to leak out. After all, his death was far from unexpected. Immediately, Northumberland sprang into action. Jane, if he had his way, was to be crowned Queen of England in just 4 days. The key to the plan was to apprehend the Princess Mary. But when a force arrived at her residency to place her under arrest, the house was empty. Mary had already fled. In fact, truth be told, Mary had left that house back on the 4th of July and was now in Norfolk. Mary knew her rights. She was no puppet. Disinherited by her own father once before, she was not about to lose this chance at the throne. Oddly, throughout the next few days, Mary had to do it all on her own. Despite his promises, Charles V's imperial delegation did little to nothing to aid her. Meanwhile, the mayor of London was brought to the Tower, where, for the first time, he was told Jane Grey was to become queen. Probably stunned, this bewildered man, staring down several armed guards, affixed his seal to Edward's will and swore to protect the Lady Jane. Jane was then brought to the Tower, where on the 10th of July, 1553, she was crowned the Queen of England. At 7 p.m. that night, trumpeters announced Edward's death and proclaimed Jane queen simultaneously. According to all reports, thousands of Londoners stood silently, their faces, quote, sorrowful and averted, end quote. They all knew what this meant. The Wars of the Roses seemed once more upon the kingdom. Then, on the 11th of July, the very next day, the council received a letter from Mary. Her defiance reverberated throughout. Mourning her brother's passing, she made clear that the crown was hers and hers alone. Her claim, backed by an act of Parliament and her father's will, was self-evident. She wrote, quote, "You know, the realm and the whole world knoweth. The rolls and records appear by the authority of the king, our said father, and the king, our said brother, and the subjects of this realm, so that we verily trust that there is no good true subject, that is, can or would pretend to be ignorant thereof," end quote. She announced her intention to openly proclaim and publish her title as the rightful Queen of England. So then it was decided that an armed guard, led by the Duke of Suffolk, would go and apprehend Mary. But he dithered and dithered. Exasperated, Northumberland decided that he would go on his own. The next morning, he departed with 600 men. But as he marched, the news of Edward's death and Jane's ascension, plus Mary's proclamation, struck both England and the continent. Europe, for its part, seemed ready to recognize Jane. England wasn't so sure. Many towns were uncertain whether to proclaim Jane or Mary queen, and did nothing at all. Sending his infantry first, Northumberland's army made its way toward Cambridge. But once more, Mary was one step ahead. She had already sent word to her supporters, who had begun to flock to her defense. Mary realized she couldn't stand up to Northumberland, and so she kept moving. These armed people that he was calling to her defense was just a buffer. It was a smart move, by the way. As she moved, sight of her led town after town to refuse to support Lady Jane. In fact, town after town declared for Mary. Cities soon followed suit. Northumberland simultaneously fired off messages to the continent to Henry II, desperate for French military support. Henry sent back messages indicating he would support Jane's claim, but he didn't send any actual aid. Peasants continued to rise in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire as morale around Jane in the Tower plummeted. The greatest turning point, however, was yet to come. Before Northumberland's departure, he had dispatched 6 ships containing around 900 men towards Yarmouth in an attempt to arrest Mary, but they had been hastily prepared, with men of little naval experience and pressed into service. To ensure his orders were obeyed, Northumberland had removed the ship's captains, placing his retinue in charge of the fleet. His servant Gilbert Grice being in charge of the 200-ton ship, the Greyhound. However, a storm scattered the ships, and forced the Greyhound to seek shelter. There, Grice went ashore to discover news and muster men, but found himself arrested by suspicious townspeople. The Greyhound then lay at anchor for 2 days, while the ship's master received enticements from both sides, Grice sending him 3 gold rings, requesting he come ashore and speak with him. Eventually, it was Mary's servant who was allowed to get on board, but he was unable to convince the crew to take sides, and the Greyhound cast anchor in search of rest. By now desperate for wages, the mariners had broken open Grice's chest and distributed the money therein for themselves. Hearing the news that Greyhound had arrived nearby, Mary sent her household officer to speak with the crew. At this point, the crew, having had enough, asked Mary's troops if they would simply arrest the officers. They replied, of course, that they would, and as a result, the Greyhound switched sides. However, the decision of the ships to defect to Mary was hardly the mutiny that many commentators since have made out of it. Many of the crew had found themselves hastily thrown together under the control of an unknown and inexperienced captain. Their resolve had been tested to the extremes by the storm, yet they held out from declaring for Mary until it was clear that their comrades would not take up arms against them. Back in the tower, however, news of the ship's defection struck morale badly. The nobility had now become prisoners in their own fortress, with Suffolk refusing to allow them to leave the tower. Stuck in Cambridge, Northumberland began to grow uneasy. And now the bad news started to come like waterfalls. The next day, Northumberland received news that the Earl of Oxford had defected. The same day, he got word that members of the ruling elite in Sussex had proclaimed Mary queen. It was over. Northumberland had failed. The next day, the great magnate himself proclaimed Mary queen. He hoped his about-face would earn himself a pardon. He received an immediate reply. He was to disarm his men and await further instructions. Mary, for her part, knew little of what was happening as events continued to spiral. When she did receive word of Northumberland's capitulation, she was overjoyed. Her first act was to erect a permanent crucifix on the wall of the residency she happened to be occupying, and an early sign of things to come. To Mary, this was nothing less than the will of God manifested. She would restore England to the true faith, or she would die trying. Now back in the Tower, Jane was despondent. She never wanted the crown. Now, no doubt, holding back tears, she wrote to her father, the Duke of Suffolk, that she was going to abdicate. Now, as a quick aside, remember, Jane Grey is technically the right trivia answer for the question, who was the shortest serving English monarch? She was queen for 9 days. On the 3rd of August, 1553, Mary made her triumphal entry into London. 5 days later, her half-brother was finally laid to rest in Westminster. Despite some initial fears of vengeance, Mary issued a blanket pardon for all those who had supported Jane. Except Northumberland, that is, and, sadly, Jane herself. Northumberland was brought to trial on charges of treason and convicted to a sentence of death. Jane met the same fate. Arriving at Tower Hill, Northumberland was the first to proceed to the scaffold. Throwing off his gown, he leant upon its east rail. He confessed how he had been, quote, an evil liver, and having done wickedly all the days of my life, and of all most against the Queen's Highness, end quote. He asked for forgiveness, and then fell on his knees, claiming he was not the original doer of his treason. There were others, but he refused to name them. Instead, he placed the blame for his fall elsewhere, upon the, quote, false and seditious preachers, end quote. He believed that they had led him to denounce the true Catholic faith. Exalting this one faith, he rounded upon the arrogance of those who had believed that Edward's reign heralded a new start, saying, quote, for I pray you, since the death of King Henry VIII, into what misery we have been brought, what open rebellion, what sedition, what great division has been brought throughout the whole realm. For God hath delivered us up to our own sensualities, and every day we wax worse and worse, end quote. He asked forgiveness for all that he had offended. He thanked Mary in particular for his mercy. It was all in all an impressive delay. Northumberland had acted the model of repentance, and many were apparently swayed by his words. The speech was later printed by the government in English, French, and Latin to be distributed across Europe in a concerted effort to persuade Protestants to return to the Catholic fold. The Duke then recited a prayer and a psalm. "Out of the deep I have called unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. O let thine ears consider well the voice of my complaint. If thou, Lord, will be extreme to mark what is done amiss, O Lord, who may abide it? For there is mercy with thee. Therefore shalt thou be feared. I look for the Lord, my soul doth wait for him. In his word is my trust. My soul fleeth unto the Lord before the morning watch." I say, before the morning watch. If he still held out for a last reprieve, and part of me thinks a lot of this is an effort to get a final reprieve for Mary, it would appear clear that there wasn't going to be one. Taking off Northumberland's jerkin and doublet, the executioner handed him their neckerchief. He placed his head on the block, and it was all over with one stroke of the axe. His bones were taken, ironically, to the same graveyard that held the bones of the man who had fought so hard for the right to rule before him, the Lord Somerset. Interestingly, there was another set of bones in that same graveyard, a certain Anne Boleyn, whose daughter we will finally get to meet in the next few episodes. Henry VI has one of the shorter reigns in all of English history in terms of monarchs, but I don't think that we can understate the importance of his reign for 1 second. And that's because, as I've mentioned several times, upon the death of Henry VIII in 1547, it really wasn't clear which way England was going to go religiously. Henry had walked a fine line. Sure, he had created the Church of England, but at the same time, a lot of the doctrine remained essentially Catholic. Under Edward VI, in the 6 years that he is king, but really others rule in his name, the situation is 100% transformed. By the time it's over, the English Book of Common Prayer is in place, altars have been taken down, churches have been whitewashed, stained glass windows have been removed. England is effectively Protestant. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't pockets of Catholic resistance. There are plenty, and we'll see them flare up big time in the coming episodes. But the reality is that in 1547, you might have turned back the clock. But as Mary is going to find out in 1553, there simply was no going back. And so with all that being said, next time, Bloody Mary.